High above the world, where the air becomes thin and silence feels almost alive, there is a mountain that does not belong to time, Mount Kailash, a place untouched, unmoving, eternal, where it is said that nothing happens by accident and every event echoes across the fabric of existence. And on that mountain, something impossible happened. A child was created, not born. A guardian stood against a god, and in a single moment, everything changed. Because this is the story of a boy who did exactly what he was told, and lost his head for it. But if you listen closely, you'll realize this isn't just a myth. It's a story about identity, about obedience, about power, and about the moment when everything you think you are is taken away from you. In the high silence of Mount Kailash, where the world seems to exist between breaths, there is a stillness so deep that it feels almost aware, as if the mountain itself were witnessing everything that unfolds upon it. Snow rests over its peaks like an eternal veil, untouched by time, while the wind moves slowly across the stone, carrying whispers of something ancient, something that has always been there. This is not a place of noise or movement, but of presence, pure, uninterrupted presence, and within that vast, sacred stillness lived Parvati, the embodiment of creation itself. She was not simply a goddess in the way stories describe divinity. She was the force that gives shape to existence, the quiet intelligence behind every form, the energy that turns the invisible into something real. Where Shiva dissolves, she manifests. Where he empties, she fills. And yet, within all that power, there was something deeply intimate about her, something grounded and human, as if even creation itself longed for moments that belonged only to itself. That day, the light on Mount Kailash felt softer, almost suspended, as if time itself had slowed down. The air carried the subtle fragrance of sandalwood, warm and earthy, blending with the cold purity of the mountain. Parvati moved with quiet intention, each step deliberate, each movement aligned with something deeper than thought. She was preparing to bathe, but this was no ordinary act. It was a ritual, a return inward, a moment of complete withdrawal from everything external, a space where even the divine chooses to be alone. And in that moment, as she stood between the outer world and her inner stillness, something became clear to her. She did not want interruption, she did not want presence, she did not want even the slightest disturbance in that space she was about to enter. Not out of fear, not out of insecurity, but out of clarity. Because even the force that creates everything needs a boundary. Even consciousness itself needs a place where it is untouched. Instead of calling for protection, instead of relying on what already existed, Parvati chose something else entirely. She chose to create. She lowered herself to the ground, the stone beneath her cool and steady, and took the sandalwood paste that covered her skin, infused with her own essence, her own energy, her own life force. There was something deeply symbolic in this act. She was not creating from something separate, something distant, something external. She was creating from herself, from her own substance, from her own being. Her hands began to move slowly, shaping the paste with care and precision, as if she were not inventing something new, but remembering something that had always been there. First the torso, then the arms, then the legs, each form emerging naturally, without force, guided by an inner knowing that required no effort. The figure began to take shape, gradually becoming more defined, more complete, until the outline of a young boy stood before her. His face was calm, untouched by experience, a blank expression that held no history, no memory, no identity, only potential. And yet, there was something about him that already felt present, as if awareness had been waiting just beneath the surface, ready to emerge. Parvati paused, her hands still, her gaze fixed on the figure. The air around them seemed to thicken, the silence deepening, as if reality itself were holding space for what was about to happen. There was no doubt in her, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty. Then she leaned forward, slowly, gently, and she breathed. It was not just breath, it was intention made tangible, consciousness moving from one form into another. The moment her breath touched the figure, something shifted. The stillness broke. The line between form and life dissolved. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a subtle movement in the chest, a faint expansion, as if something inside had awakened. Then the fingers twitched slightly, the body adjusting to itself for the first time, and finally his eyes opened. There was no confusion in them, no fear, no search for meaning, only presence, direct, immediate, complete, as if he had not just been created, but had always existed, waiting only for this moment to become visible. He looked at Parvati, and she looked at him. There was no distance between them, no separation, no question of origin. He did not need to understand where he came from because he already was what he needed to be. He was not just her creation, he was her extension, her will given form, her essence made visible. Parvati stepped closer, her presence calm but grounded in something absolute, and spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that did not need force to be understood.
You are mine.
The words settled into him without resistance, without interpretation. They did not define him, they revealed him.
You were created from me, from my body, from my being, from my essence. And you will stand at this door.
Her gaze shifted toward the entrance behind him, a simple threshold that separated the inner from the outer, the private from the visible, the sacred from the accessible.
No one enters unless I allow it.
There was no emphasis in her voice, no need to reinforce the instruction. It was not a command that required obedience, it was a truth that required alignment. The boy listened, not thinking, not questioning, not resisting. He simply received. And in that moment, something fundamental was established. Not just a role, but a state of being. He was not there to interpret reality. He was not there to adapt or negotiate. He was there to stand, to hold, to guard. Without hesitation, he nodded. Then he turned and took his place at the entrance, his posture still, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering. The mountain remained silent. The wind continued its slow passage across the stone. Nothing in the world seemed to change, and yet something had already been set in motion. Time passed on Mount Kailash in the way it always had, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if time itself moved differently in that place. The light shifted across the peaks, the wind continued its endless path over stone and silence, and the world remained suspended in that quiet, watchful stillness. And at the entrance, exactly where he had been placed, the boy stood, unmoving, present, rooted in a purpose he did not question and did not need to understand. He did not measure time. He did not grow restless. He did not wonder if something else existed beyond the task he had been given. His world was simple, but not limited. It was clear. There was a boundary, and he was that boundary. There was a threshold, and he was its guardian. There was an instruction, and he was its embodiment. And then, something changed. Far in the distance, before any form could be seen, there was a shift in the air. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, subtle at first, then undeniable. The stillness did not disappear, but it deepened, as if something greater had entered it. The mountain itself seemed to recognize it. The space responded before the eyes could. And slowly, emerging from that vast silence, a figure approached. Shiva had returned. There was nothing exaggerated in his presence, nothing that needed to announce itself. And yet, everything around him seemed to bend slightly, as if reality itself adjusted in response. His steps were calm, effortless, but carried a weight that was not physical. It was something deeper, something that did not belong to the visible world alone. He was not just a being moving through space. He was a force that reshaped it. He walked toward his dwelling, toward the entrance that had never been closed to him, toward a space that had always been open, always accessible. Until now, because standing at the threshold, there was someone. The boy did not move. His posture remained exactly the same, his gaze steady, his presence anchored in something that did not waver, even as the most powerful being in existence approached him. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sense of who stood before him, no calculation of what this moment meant, only clarity. Shiva stopped. For a brief moment, the two simply faced each other. The mountain, the sky, the wind. Everything seemed to pause around them, as if witnessing something that had not happened before. Shiva looked at the boy, not with anger, not yet, but with curiosity. This was not a presence he recognized, not a being he had created, not a force he had encountered. And yet there he was, standing at the entrance, unmoving.
Step aside,
Shiva said. His voice was calm, almost effortless, as if the words themselves carried no weight because they did not need to. He was not used to being questioned, not used to being stopped, not used to encountering resistance. But the boy did not move.
My mother is inside. She has ordered that no one may enter,
He said, his voice steady, clear, without tension. There was no defiance in his tone, no attempt to challenge, no desire to oppose. He was not standing against Shiva, he was simply standing in his place. The air shifted again. Something subtle but undeniable passed between them. Shiva's gaze hardened slightly, not out of anger but out of recognition that this was not a misunderstanding. This was not confusion. This was resistance.
What you are doing is not wise.
Shiva said, his voice still calm but now carrying something deeper. But the boy did not react. He did not step aside. He remained exactly where he was. And in that moment, something fundamental collided. Authority met obedience. Power met purpose. The infinite met the unyielding. Shiva's attendants, who had begun to gather behind him, exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to amusement. To them, this was absurd, a child standing in the way of Shiva himself. They stepped forward, one by one at first, then with more confidence, attempting to push past him, to brush him aside, to treat him as something insignificant. But the boy resisted. Not violently, but completely. Every attempt to move him was met with the same unwavering presence. He did not strike first, he did not provoke, but he did not yield. And when force was applied to him, he responded, not with anger, but with precision, with clarity, with a kind of grounded strength that did not belong to someone who had just come into existence. Again and again they tried, and again and again. He held his position. There was no frustration in him, no doubt, no internal conflict, because he was not acting from ego. He was not trying to win. He was fulfilling a role, and that made him immovable. Shiva watched, at first with curiosity, then with irritation, and then with something more complex, because this was no longer about a child blocking a doorway. This was about something deeper, a force that did not recognize hierarchy, that did not adjust based on power, that did not bend simply because something greater stood before it. This boy did not know who Shiva was, and because he did not know, he did not fear, and because he did not fear, he did not move. The tension began to rise, not in noise, not in chaos, but in density, in the way the air felt heavier, in the way the silence became more charged, in the way every presence there seemed to lean toward what was about to happen. Shiva stepped forward. The movement was subtle, but everything responded to it. The ground, the air, the space itself. Everything seemed to shift slightly, as if reality understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. He stood directly before the boy now, close enough to see the details of his face, close enough to feel the unwavering stillness in him. For a moment, nothing happened. Just presence, meeting presence. Two beings standing at a threshold, neither willing to step aside. And then, slowly, Shiva raised his hand. There was no anger in the gesture, only decision, and in that decision there was finality. The boy did not step back. He did not hesitate. He did not question what was about to happen. He stood, exactly as he had been told, exactly as he had chosen. And in a single movement, Shiva struck. There was no sound, only a sudden, absolute shift. The body fell, silent. The head was gone. And just like that, the stillness returned, but it was no longer the same. For a moment, nothing moved. The mountain remained still, the wind continued its slow passage over the stone, and the sky above Mount Kailash stretched wide and indifferent, as if creation itself had not yet understood what had just happened. The boy's body lay at the entrance, exactly where he had stood, no longer guarding the threshold, no longer breathing, no longer holding the command he had been given. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, unnatural, almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that comes after something irreversible has taken place, when the world has not yet reacted, but already knows that it must. Then Parvati emerged. She stepped out from the inner chamber with the calm of someone returning from sacred solitude, still wrapped in the softness of the ritual she had entered. But that calm lasted only a fraction of a moment. Her gaze moved toward the entrance, toward the place where her son had been standing, and then everything inside her stopped. The world narrowed into a single image, the body of the child she had created from herself, lifeless on the ground. The boy who had opened his eyes for the first time because of her breath. The boy who had listened to her voice, accepted her command, and stood exactly where she had placed him. The boy who had done nothing wrong except obey. At first she did not speak. She simply looked at him, as if her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. There are moments of pain so immense that they do not become emotion immediately. They become stillness. They become a blank space where the soul cannot move forward. Parvati stood there, caught between disbelief and recognition, between the memory of creation and the reality of destruction. And then, slowly, something shifted in her face. The softness disappeared. The grief rose first, deep and silent, and beneath it came something far more terrifying. Fury. Not the fury of wounded pride, not the fury of insult, not the fury of a goddess who had been disobeyed. This was the fury of creation itself, when what it loves has been violated. It was the rage of life when life is taken unjustly. It was the force that gives birth, turning toward the power that destroys and saying, no further. The air changed around her. The mountain, which had held its silence for ages, seemed to tremble beneath her presence. The light dimmed. The sky, once vast and open, darkened as if shadow were spreading from the center of her grief. What had been sacred stillness became pressure. What had been peace became warning. Parvati was no longer simply the gentle mother, the luminous goddess, the quiet force of life. In that moment, every hidden aspect of her power awakened. The tenderness that had shaped the boy now revealed its other face, the uncompromising force that protects what has been born from it. Shiva stood nearby, and for the first time, the meaning of what had happened began to unfold fully before him. Until that moment, the boy had been an obstacle, a mystery, an unknown presence blocking a familiar path. But now, through Parvati's eyes, the truth became unavoidable. This was not a stranger. This was not merely a child at the doorway. This was her creation, her son, her own essence given form, and he had been destroyed because he had remained faithful to the very instruction she had given him. Parvati's gaze lifted from the body and turned toward Shiva. There was no pleading in her eyes, no confusion, no weakness, only a grief so complete that it had become power.
You have destroyed my son.
The words were quiet, but they did not need volume. They moved through the air like a judgment. Every being present felt them, every attendant, every spirit, every force that had witnessed the confrontation understood that the story had changed. This was no longer about a doorway, no longer about who had the right to enter, no longer about authority. It was about consequence. And then Parvati spoke again.
If my son is not returned to life, I will withdraw my power from the universe. I will let creation fall apart. I will let everything that breathes, grows, moves, loves, and becomes dissolve.
The threat was not theatrical. It was not exaggerated. It was terrifying because it was true. Parvati was not merely one goddess among many. She was Shakti, the living power without which even gods cannot act. Without her, form cannot hold. Without her, life cannot arise. Without her, the universe becomes hollow structure, without pulse, body without breath, existence without movement. If she withdrew, creation itself would begin to collapse. And the cosmos felt it. The tremor spread beyond Kailash, the wind turned restless, the elements began to lose their harmony. Across realms seen and unseen, a disturbance moved like a wave through the fabric of existence. The Devas felt it. The sages felt it. Beings who had never seen Mount Kailash turned inward with sudden fear, sensing that something essential had been wounded at the root of the world. Shiva understood then that this could not be answered with silence. It could not be answered with power. It could not be erased. Something had to be restored, and it had to be restored immediately. He stepped toward Parvati, not as the unstoppable ascetic, not as the lord of destruction, but as one who now recognized the damage caused by his own action. There was no ordinary apology that could reach the depth of what had been broken. Words alone would mean nothing. The only possible response was restoration. He turned to his attendants, and the command came with absolute urgency.
Go north. Find the first living being you encounter facing north. Bring me its head.
The instruction was strange, almost impossible to understand at first. But in these ancient stories, details are never only details. The north was not chosen randomly. It was the direction of stillness, ascent, spiritual orientation, the direction associated with higher realms and transcendence. The being found in that direction would not simply replace what had been lost. It would become part of a transformation. The attendants did not question him. They moved quickly across the mountain and beyond it, leaving behind the darkened silence of Kailash. Their search carried them through forests and valleys, through places where the air was thick with life and the earth still held the warmth of movement. They looked for the first living being that fulfilled the command, and at last they found it. An elephant, calm and immense, facing north. There was something solemn in the sight. The elephant stood with a presence unlike that of smaller creatures. It did not seem restless, it did not seem afraid. It carried the gravity of memory in its body, the patience of ancient earth, the quiet intelligence of a being that does not rush because it does not need to. In many traditions, the elephant is not merely an animal of strength. It is a symbol of wisdom, endurance, dignity, and the ability to move through obstacles not by panic, but by steady presence. The attendants returned with the elephant's head and placed it before Shiva. The scene at the threshold remained charged with unbearable weight. Parvati stood near the lifeless body of her son, her grief still burning through the air. Shiva approached the boy and knelt beside him. For a moment he looked at the small body lying there, the body that had stood against him without hatred, without pride, without fear. A child born from devotion and destroyed by a collision of forces too vast for him to understand. Then Shiva took the elephant's head and placed it upon the boy's body. The act was strange, almost impossible, and yet deeply precise. The human head that had been lost was not simply being replaced. A new consciousness was being joined to the old body. The child who had been created from Parvati's essence would now be restored through Shiva's power, marked forever by both creation and destruction. He would carry the tenderness of the mother and the transformation of the father. He would no longer belong only to the doorway where he had fallen. He would belong to every doorway. Shiva placed his hand upon him and invoked life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shifted, the body stirred, a breath entered. Slowly, impossibly, the chest rose, the fingers moved, the stillness broke, and Ganesh opened his eyes. But the eyes that opened were no longer only the eyes of the boy who had stood at the door. Something vast had entered him, something ancient, something steady. He was the same, and yet not the same. The child had returned, but through death he had crossed a boundary no ordinary being could cross. He had lost one identity and awakened into another. Parvati moved toward him immediately. The fury in her did not vanish all at once, because grief does not disappear simply because life returns. But beneath it, something softened. The impossible had happened. The son she had created, the child she had lost, was breathing again. She held him close, and in that embrace, the universe itself seemed to exhale. The dark pressure began to loosen. The sky slowly opened. The mountain regained its silence, but now the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence after restoration. Shiva looked upon the restored child and understood that life alone was not enough. The wound had to be honored. The mistake had to be transformed into meaning. The boy could not simply return to what he had been, because what had happened had changed the structure of the story forever. So Shiva gave him a place no one could take from him. He declared that this child would be honored before all others. Before any ritual, before any journey, before any sacred act, before any beginning, his name would be invoked first. He would be known as Ganesh, Lord of the Ganas, guardian of thresholds, remover of obstacles. the one who stands at the entrance between what was and what is about to become. This was not a decorative title, it was a cosmic correction. The boy who had been treated as an obstacle became the remover of obstacles. The child who had blocked the door became the guardian of all doors. The one who had lost his head became the one invoked before human beings try to find their way through confusion, resistance, fear, and change. And so the story did not end with death, it ended with transformation. Ganesh rose not as the same child who had fallen, but as a being who carried the mark of the threshold itself. His large elephant head became a sign of wisdom beyond ordinary identity. His body, still connected to the earth, became a reminder that spiritual power does not float away from life, but lives within it. His presence became gentle, strange, compassionate, and powerful all at once. From that day forward, whenever someone begins something new, whenever a door opens, whenever a path becomes uncertain, whenever an obstacle appears too large to cross, Ganesh is remembered first, because he knows the threshold. He knows what it means to stand there. He knows what it means to lose one form and awaken into another. And this is where the story stops being only a story. Because once Ganesh rises, once the child who lost his head becomes the god who is honored before every beginning, the myth turns toward us. It stops belonging only to Mount Kailash, to Shiva, to Parvati, to the ancient world of gods and mountains, and begins to speak directly to something hidden inside the human heart. Because every person, at some point, stands at a threshold. Every life reaches a doorway where the old self cannot pass through unchanged, and every true beginning asks for something to be left behind. Ganesh's story is not simply about a child who obeyed his mother and was restored by divine power. It is about the mystery of transformation. The boy was created with one identity, one purpose, one clear instruction: guard the door. And he did it with perfect devotion. He did not bend because someone more powerful appeared. He did not abandon his place because the situation became uncomfortable. He did not betray the truth he had been given just because the world outside the door demanded access. In that sense, Ganesh represents something incredibly rare. The part of us that can stand firm before pressure, before authority, before fear, before the need to be approved by something greater than ourselves. But the story also shows something more difficult. Sometimes, even when we are sincere, even when we are devoted, even when we are doing exactly what we believe is right, life still breaks us open. The head is cut. The old identity falls. The form we thought we were cannot continue. And from a human perspective, this feels unfair. It feels brutal. It feels like punishment. But in symbolic stories, death is rarely only death. The loss of the head is the loss of the old way of seeing. It is the collapse of a limited identity. It is the moment when the small self, the self that says, "This is who I am," is interrupted by a force much larger than itself. That is why Ganesh does not return with the same head. He is not restored exactly as he was. He is transformed, and this is the part of the story that matters most. Real transformation does not simply give us back what we lost. It changes the meaning of the loss. It takes the wound and turns it into wisdom. It takes the obstacle and turns it into a path. It takes the place where we were broken and makes it the very place from which our deeper purpose begins. The elephant head is not random. It carries the qualities Ganesh will now embody: wisdom, memory, strength, patience, and the ability to move through obstacles without panic. An elephant does not rush through the world. It does not need to prove its power. It simply moves with presence. It remembers. It listens. It clears the path not through violence, but through steadiness. And this is why Ganesh becomes the remover of obstacles. Not because he avoids difficulty, but because he has passed through the ultimate rupture and returned with a larger consciousness. There is also something deeply beautiful in the way the story transforms conflict into blessing. The child who was first seen as an obstacle becomes the one who removes obstacles. The one who blocked the door becomes the guardian of all doors. The one whose head was taken becomes the one invoked before any new beginning. This is one of the great teachings hidden inside the myth. Sometimes the thing that appears to be blocking the path is actually protecting the sacred space where transformation must happen. Sometimes the obstacle is not against you. Sometimes the obstacle is the threshold itself. asking whether you are truly ready to enter. And maybe that is why Ganesh is remembered before beginnings, before a journey, before a ritual, before a new chapter, before a difficult decision, before a creative act, before a life transition. Because every beginning contains uncertainty. Every beginning contains resistance. Every beginning asks, are you willing to cross this threshold differently than you arrived? And Ganesha stands there not as a distant god of luck, but as a reminder that the first obstacle is often not outside us. It is the old identity we are still trying to carry through a doorway that requires us to change. So when we look at Ganesh, we are not only looking at a divine figure with an elephant head, we are looking at a map of transformation. His large ears remind us to listen more deeply. His small eyes remind us to focus. His broken tusk reminds us that imperfection does not prevent wisdom. His large belly reminds us that life must be digested, not rejected. His presence at the doorway reminds us that nothing sacred begins without awareness. And his story reminds us that even what is lost can become part of a greater form. The question, then, is not whether this story happened exactly as we imagine it. The deeper question is, where is this story happening inside you? Where are you standing at a door trying to protect something sacred? Where are you being pressured to abandon your truth because something louder, stronger, or more powerful is demanding access? Where has life cut away an identity you thought you needed? And where might that loss be preparing you to become something wiser, steadier, and more complete? Because perhaps the path does not begin when everything is easy. Perhaps the path begins when something in us is interrupted, when the old head falls, when the old way of seeing no longer works, when we are forced to stop living from fear, performance, and habit, and begin living from a deeper intelligence. That is the hidden gift of Ganesh's story. It tells us that being broken is not always the end. Sometimes it is the moment before a new form of consciousness arrives. And so, before the next beginning in your life, before the next door opens, before you try to force your way forward, remember Ganesha. Remember the child who stood his ground. Remember the loss that became wisdom. Remember the obstacle that became the path. And ask yourself quietly and honestly, what part of me must I stop carrying, so that something deeper can finally begin? If this story spoke to something in you, stay with that feeling for a moment. And if you want more stories like this, ancient myths told with depth, mystery, and meaning, subscribe to Dharma Light, where every story is a doorway, and every doorway leads a little closer to awakening.